Usually, when we talk about learning a new language, there's this fundamental expectation of precision, right?
Right, yeah, you expect it to function a bit like engineering.
Exactly. You learn the basic vocabulary, you internalize the grammar, and then you open a dictionary. And that dictionary points to a word and gives you a definitive, objective reality.
It provides this sense of epistemological comfort. We inherently desire our communication to be literal and easily categorized.
Yeah, you look at a piece of fruit, you look at the word apple, and the linguistic equation balances perfectly. It's a one-to-one transfer.
Right, because when a language operates with that kind of rigid structural integrity, it allows us to cross borders, build societies, all with a shared understanding of what constitutes reality. A word either means the thing it describes or it doesn't.
But the moment you step off the elevator and walk into an American corporate office, that entire expectation just shatters. You are suddenly navigating a linguistic landscape that operates on a completely different set of physics.
Oh, absolutely. The dictionary you brought with you is entirely useless.
Completely useless. You are handed this conceptual map where the compass spins wildly and the words coming out of people's mouths seem entirely, almost deliberately disconnected from the physical reality of the work being done.
Yeah, and you have likely experienced this directly.
Oh, for sure. If you're listening to this, you know. If you have ever sat in a sterile conference room or stared at a grid of faces on a virtual call and heard someone say with complete sincerity, let's circle back and touch base offline so we can synergize our bandwidth.
Right. You know exactly how disorienting that is.
You sit there thinking, wait, what on earth did any of those syllables actually convey?
I mean, it sounds like nonsense.
It really does. And that's why today we are undertaking a custom deep dive into our provided source material, which is this comprehensive linguistic breakdown of American corporate jargon.
It's such a great set of sources, too.
It is, and we are decoding this dialect, not just to laugh at its absurdity, but because understanding the subtext of these phrases is an absolute non-negotiable requirement for survival and upward mobility in a U.S. workplace.
What's fascinating here is that this jargon is not an accident. It is not merely a random collection of trendy buzzwords that happen to stick to the walls of the corporate ecosystem.
Right. It's intentional.
Highly intentional. What we are looking at is an incredibly sophisticated, highly evolved linguistic survival mechanism. It has been meticulously shaped by decades of corporate culture to achieve two very specific goals.
And those are?
Well, first, it functions to make vague, formless, or deeply mundane ideas sound critically important and intellectually rigorous. And second, and far more importantly, it's designed to completely shield the speaker from any tangible, trackable accountability.
Wow. So it's armor.
Exactly. It is fundamentally a form of defensive armor that has been cleverly disguised to look like forward-moving productivity.
Okay, let's unpack this because that reframes the entire experience of going to work.
It really does shift your perspective.
The idea that people aren't just communicating, but are actively walking the halls, clutching their travel mugs, speaking a highly defensive code language to protect themselves from liability, it's massive. It's everywhere.
To really understand the mechanics of this armor, we have to start on the primary battlefield where it gets deployed daily. We have to look at the quintessential American meeting.
Oh, yes. The meeting. The pre-meeting. The meeting to align on the agenda for the strategy meeting.
It's endless. When you are sitting in that room, verbally maneuvering in real time in front of your peers and superiors, you are in an incredibly vulnerable position.
You really are. You're required to sound highly engaged, forward-thinking, and collaborative.
But simultaneously, you absolutely cannot commit to a single concrete action if you do not have total certainty about the outcome.
Right, because that's how you get trapped.
Exactly. And this friction bursts a specific set of tools that sociologists and our sources refer to as the art of deferral. Two of the absolute heaviest hitters in this category are, let's circle back and put a pin in that.
Those two phrases serve as the absolute load-bearing pillars of polite corporate evasion.
They really do. Consider the mechanics of a meeting. Someone introduces a variable that disrupts the flow. Perhaps they ask for the finalized Q3 budget numbers, but you do not possess those numbers yet.
Or they bring up a structural flaw in a project that you just don't have the political capital to deal with right then.
Exactly. In a standard, precise language, you would just say, I do not know the answer, or I am unwilling to discuss this right now.
But you can't say that in an office.
No, because in the corporate dialect, blunt honesty is perceived as either incompetence or aggression. So instead, you deploy the deferral. You say, let's circle back on this next week.
Or if someone introduces a tangential idea that threatens to derail the agenda, you don't tell them their idea is a distraction. You say, let's put a pin in that and maintain our focus on the immediate deliverables.
Right, it's so smooth.
The imagery baked into both of those phrases is doing so much heavy lifting. It's incredibly gentle, almost domestic.
Yes, the geometry of circling back.
Yes, the geometry of circling back. Exactly. Circling back implies this geometric certainty. We are simply tracing a curved path that will inevitably smoothly return us to this exact point of origin. There are no sharp edges.
No abrupt stops.
And putting a pin in it, it conjures this tactile analog image of taking a colorful little push pin and carefully securing a piece of paper to a corkboard. It tells the person, your idea is precious. I am physically elevating it and preserving it on the board where it's safe.
But the reality is that the metaphorical corkboard is a graveyard.
Yes, it's a graveyard for ideas.
The gentleness of the imagery is the precise reason these phrases are so effective at neutralizing conflict. But if we examine the underlying psychological reality, the function of the deferral is entirely about managing velocity.
Managing velocity, I like that.
In corporate America, the perception of forward momentum is often valued more highly than actual rigorous problem solving. If a meeting stalls for 20 minutes because of a complex question, the collective anxiety of the room spikes.
Because everyone feels like their time is being squandered.
Exactly. So phrases like "circle back" act as a vital pressure valve. They satisfy the social requirement of acknowledging the contribution, saving the face of the person who spoke, while broadcasting an aggressive signal that the collective entity is moving past the obstacle.
Moving past without resolving it.
Right. The unspoken truth, deeply understood by everyone fluent in the dialect, is that "let's circle back" very frequently translates to a desperate hope that the topic is permanently forgotten.
It is literally the verbal equivalent of hitting the snooze button on your alarm clock. You are not reaching over and permanently disabling the alarm because that would be a dereliction of duty.
Right, you're just delaying it.
You are acknowledging that the alarm is ringing, but you are absolutely refusing to engage with the reality of the morning at this specific moment. You are buying yourself 9 minutes of artificial peace.
That's a great analogy.
Or, to look at it structurally, it's like an air traffic controller dealing with a dangerously congested airspace. A pilot radios in with an idea, and the controller says, "Flight 409, we see you on the radar. We acknowledge your desire to land this concept, but the runway is currently occupied by the Q3 objectives.
We are putting you in a holding pattern.
Keep circling the airport. We will radio you when the tarmac is clear." And the dark secret of the corporate airspace is that the tarmac is never, ever clear. The planes just circle until they run out of fuel and quietly disappear.
The holding pattern analogy captures the dynamic perfectly because it highlights the illusion of management. The controller sounds entirely in command of the situation, even while actively delaying the resolution.
They sound totally in charge.
But if the holding pattern fails, or if a particular aircraft is becoming too loud and disruptive on the radio, the corporate speaker must escalate to a more advanced, slightly more surgical evasion tactic.
Which brings us to the phrase, "let's take this offline."
Yes, take it offline.
It carries this sheen of high-level technical efficiency. It sounds like you are initiating a secure, encrypted protocol.
Well, the etymology of the phrase is deeply tied to that technical sheen. It originates from the early days of mainframe computing and telecommunications, referring to a state where a device is disconnected from the central network, operating independently and privately.
Right, so it literally meant not on the main network.
Exactly. And in the modern corporate dialect, it's deployed when a localized conversation becomes too granular, too structurally controversial, or quite frankly, too aggressively tedious for the wider audience in the room.
Like when two engineers start intensely debating database architecture during a marketing sync.
Yes. The manager will interject and say, "This is a fantastic technical dialogue, but let's take this offline so we ensure we get through the rest of the agenda."
You're witnessing a real-time act of crowd control.
Absolutely. By physically or chronologically severing the discussion from the online public forum of the meeting, the leader prevents a hyper-specific dispute from consuming the extremely expensive shared time of the collective. It quarantines the issue.
I have to challenge the inherent benevolence of that quarantine, though. I mean, the framing makes it sound like the manager is just efficiently optimizing the schedule.
Okay, fair point.
Isn't taking it offline frequently weaponized?
Yeah.
Like, is it actually a productive way to protect the agenda? Or is it just an incredibly sanitized, cowardly way for a manager to silence legitimate dissent in a public forum.
That is the necessary counterweight to the efficiency argument, yeah.
Because if an employee raises a massive glaring flaw in a proposed timeline and the manager immediately says, let's take this offline, it looks an awful lot like shutting down a whistleblower before the rest of the team realizes the whistleblower is entirely correct.
The phrase really exists on a razor's edge between optimization and suppression, and the environment dictates its true function. In a structurally healthy organization with high psychological safety, taking it offline is a genuine logistical necessity.
Because matrix organizations can't function if 12 people have to sit silently while 2 people argue about a pivot table.
Exactly. The cognitive load on the room is too high, and the financial cost of those salaries sitting idle is unjustifiable. However, your pushback highlights the darker utility of the phrase.
The suppression tactic.
Yes, in a toxic or heavily siloed environment, it is absolutely a suppression tactic. It is utilized specifically to remove the audience. If a leader feels their authority or their narrative is being credible and challenged, taking it offline allows them to abruptly terminate the public visibility of that challenge.
It forces the dissenting employee into a one-on-one scenario later,
where the hierarchical power dynamics overwhelmingly favor the manager, rather than allowing the debate to play out in a room where the employee might organically gather allies and build a consensus of doubt. It surgically neutralizes the threat of collective realization.
Wow. It is the fragmentation of a potential union of thought. You separate the dissenting node from the network so the network remains compliant.
That's exactly how it functions.
That is incredibly intense for a phrase that, if you translate it directly, just means let's talk later.
It is intense.
And it leads us directly into another cluster of phrases from the source material that ostensibly just mean let's talk, but carry a completely different cultural weight. Let's examine, touch base, and run it up the flagpole.
Touch base is arguably the most ubiquitous phrase in the American white-collar ecosystem. It is pervasive across all mediums, hallway interactions, direct messages, emails.
Let me just touch base with you this afternoon.
Right. It implies an interaction of incredible low stakes and low friction. Conversely, run it up the flagpole, while carrying a slightly more vintage mid-century resonance, remains a crucial operational concept.
It signifies the act of testing a tentative idea with higher tiers of leadership.
To gauge their reaction before formally committing resources to it, let's run this new design up the flagpole and see who salutes.
It instantly transports you to a 1960s Madison Avenue ad agency. It has that smoke-filled room, Don Draper quality to it.
It carries that historical residue, yes. But both of these phrases, despite their different eras of origin, point toward a profound, deeply ingrained paradox within the American workplace.
Which is?
They perfectly illustrate the intense cultural desire for widespread consensus running headlong into a deep-seated democratic aversion to rigid, formal hierarchy.
Oh, we need to dissect that aversion to formal hierarchy, because anyone who works in a corporation knows that hierarchy absolutely exists. There's a rigid org chart.
Of course there is.
There are vice presidents, directors, managers, and individual contributors. The power differential is mathematically codified in their salaries. So where does the aversion come into play?
Well, the hierarchy exists structurally, but American corporate culture despises the aesthetics of it. The culture is deeply influenced by a specific brand of egalitarian mythology.
Everyone is a team player.
Right. A formal scheduled meeting where a subordinate must bow their head and formally request a decree from a superior feels monarchical. It feels rigid and distinctly old world. It violates the cultural narrative that everyone is a collaborative partner.
So touching base circumvents that discomfort.
Brilliantly so. It utilizes a metaphor from Baseball America's historically egalitarian pastime. When a runner touches a base, they are securing a moment of safety, a brief grounding, before the play continues.
By framing an interaction as touching base, it creates the optical illusion that 2 total equals are merely syncing their trajectories on a level playing field.
It heavily softens the reality that one person is often demanding a status update from someone whose livelihood they control.
It acts as an anesthetic against the reality of the org chart.
Precisely. And running it up the flagpole operates on a similar but upward-facing mechanism of diffusion. If you demand a formal executive decision, you are forcing an executive to take rigid ownership of a potential failure.
But if you merely run a flag up a pole, you are engaging in an act of passive observation.
Exactly. You aren't demanding a decree, you are just hoisting a piece of fabric to see how the prevailing winds of leadership are blowing. It is a deeply non-committal way of seeking permission.
It allows a team to gain leadership consensus, or at least the quiet appearance of it, without ever making anyone feel like a heavy formal order was handed down from the top.
That's the illusion of the flat organization.
That makes the architecture of these interactions so much clearer. So you've successfully navigated the treacherous waters of the meeting. You have circled back, you've put pins in things, taken dangerous conversations offline, and you have touched base without triggering any hierarchical defense mechanisms.
You've survived the morning.
You have masterfully deferred any immediate, concrete decisions. But eventually, the meeting ends, and you return to your desk. And now you face a new problem.
You have to describe the work you're supposedly doing.
Right. This is where the dialect shifts gears. We transition from the art of avoidance directly into the art of inflation. We are entering the realm of buzzwords, which the source material brilliantly categorizes as productivity theater.
Productivity theater.
Yeah, the practice of utilizing trendy, heavily overstuffed vocabulary to create a mesmerizing illusion of intense, high-value, highly strategic labor. Let's start with two absolute titans of the genre, synergy and leverage.
These two words are the undisputed heavyweights of corporate inflation. If we look at synergy, the fundamental implication is that when two disparate teams or concepts are combined, they create a compounding effect that is vastly greater than the simple sum of their individual parts.
And leverage.
Leverage, on the other hand, performs a fascinating act of linguistic theft. It takes a highly specific term from classical physics, the use of a lever, to amplify physical force, and from high finance, the use of borrowed capital to exponentially increase return.
It takes these massive concepts and flattens them into a pretentious synonym for the verb use.
Exactly.
Here's where it gets really interesting, though. Corporate America possesses this insatiable hunger to steal serious, hard science terminology or high-stakes Wall Street vernacular and drape it over incredibly mundane administrative tasks.
Just to make them sound like epic undertakings.
Yes. When you are sitting at your desk pulling up an old Excel spreadsheet of client emails, you aren't just sending out a newsletter. You are leveraging your existing historical relationships.
It elevates the psychological stakes of clicking send on a MailChimp campaign.
Exactly. By utilizing that word, you are subconsciously trying to align your data entry with Archimedes discovering the mechanical advantage or a hedge fund manager moving hundreds of millions of dollars.
Well, the psychological elevation is the explicit purpose of the word. The inflation is the feature, not a bug.
Right.
If we analyze these terms through the lens of linguistics, they function as empty calorie words. They sound incredibly robust. They occupy a significant amount of phonetic space in a sentence, and they carry an air of academic or financial sophistication.
But they offer zero nutritional value.
Absolutely zero nutritional value in terms of the actual transmission of data. When a vice president stands at the front of a room and declares, "We need the marketing and sales departments to find more synergy this quarter," what they're fundamentally communicating is, you need to work together better.
But work together better is the language of a kindergarten teacher instructing toddlers in a sandbox.
Exactly. Please share your toys and don't throw sand.
Right.
But a corporate executive whose compensation package is tied to quarterly growth metrics cannot stand in front of a board of directors or a room full of jaded employees and instruct them to share their toys. It strips away the aura of executive competence.
They need a vocabulary that frames a basic human behavioral request as an advanced operational strategy.
Therefore, they say synergize. It provides a thick veneer of intellectual rigor to a concept that is fundamentally just basic human cooperation. It is linguistic camouflage designed to make the speaker look like a strategist rather than a babysitter.
And speaking of camouflage, we have to examine two phrases that take this theatricality and apply it directly to the human condition, bandwidth, and the deep dive.
Bandwidth.
I have to admit, the corporate use of the word bandwidth deeply unsettles me, because bandwidth is not a business strategy term. It is literally a telecommunications metric.
Right. It refers to the maximum rate of data transfer across a given path.
It measures how much data a cable can handle before it chokes. But in the modern office, it has been entirely co-opted to measure human capacity. An employee will look at their manager and say, "I would love to assist with that project, but I just don't have the bandwidth right now."
Which is the accepted sanitized translation for, "I am entirely too busy."
But the implications are so much heavier than just being busy. It's a fundamental reframing of what a human being is. It treats a person with a central nervous system like they are a piece of Cisco networking equipment.
That's a very stark way to look at it.
But think about the emotional reality behind that statement. If an employee looks at their boss and says, "I am profoundly overwhelmed, I am exhausted to my core, and if you assign me one more deliverable, I am going to have a physiological breakdown."
That is a highly emotional, deeply human statement of distress.
Right. And it introduces raw vulnerability into an environment built on stoicism. It makes everyone in the immediate vicinity deeply uncomfortable. So, to maintain the sterile environment of the office, we collaboratively agree to strip away all the humanity.
We strip away the exhaustion, the anxiety.
And replace it with mechanical, inanimate terminology. I lack the bandwidth. It magically transforms a human emotional crisis into a simple, objective IT routing issue.
That is a highly perceptive breakdown of the sociolinguistic mechanics at play. By voluntarily adopting the language of machines, we allow the physical and psychological limits of the human body to appear completely objective and emotionally neutral.
It's a shield.
It is an incredibly effective dual-facing shield. It protects the employee from the stigma of sounding weak, incapable, or emotionally fragile. Simultaneously, it actively protects the manager from the heavy emotional labor of having to actually manage a human being in distress.
Because a manager does not need to offer empathy to a router that has reached its data cap.
Exactly. They simply reroute the traffic. The phrase perfectly sanitizes the human experience. And we see a similar, though slightly inverse, psychological compensation with the phrase deep dive.
The phrase we are literally using as the premise of our analysis today.
Yes, exactly. A deep dive takes very standard, inherently static, and often deeply monotonous act, like reading through dense reports or analyzing a spreadsheet, and aggressively rebrands it as an intense, immersive, almost athletic endeavor.
You're no longer just a knowledge worker sitting under fluorescent lights staring at a PDF.
You are putting on a metaphorical scuba suit, checking your oxygen levels, and plunging backward into the treacherous, unexplored depths of the Q2 data lake.
It is the ultimate manifestation of productivity theater. It introduces an element of physical danger and craftsmanship to an environment completely devoid of both.
It makes the mundane feel heroic.
I am not scrolling through a 20-page Google Doc. I am Jacques Cousteau, navigating the Marianas Trench of our consumer engagement metrics.
It allows the desk worker to feel a sense of rugged exploration.
But while bandwidth and deep dive manage the perception of the worker, there's another category of buzzwords that aggressively demand actual trackable output. Let's look at the metrics-driven phrases low-hanging fruit and move the needle.
The metrics phrases are crucial.
Our sources explicitly define low-hanging fruit as the prioritization of quick wins. It refers to tasks that require minimal caloric expenditure but yield an immediate visible result. Updating the copyright year in the website footer, or fixing a typo in a sales deck.
It's the agrarian equivalent of picking the apple that requires no ladder.
Conversely, moving the needle demands a measurable kinetic impact on a major organizational goal.
Yeah. Moving the needle is the quintessential distillation of the modern, hyper-quantified corporate philosophy. It relies on the visual metaphor of an analog dial on an intricate dashboard.
If the needle isn't moving, you aren't working.
The underlying mandate is brutal in its simplicity. If a task or an employee's daily labor is not visibly making that specific dial twitch, then in the eyes of the corporate apparatus, that labor lacks inherent value.
It connects directly to the legacy of scientific management from the early 20th century, right?
Yes, where every motion of a factory worker was timed and optimized. In the modern knowledge economy, that optimization is applied to our output metrics. The culture demands immediate, legible proof of progress.
There's remarkably little patience or budget for deep foundational work.
The kind of invisible structural engineering that might take 3 years to bear fruit is heavily discouraged. The system demands that the needle twitches today, which naturally forces employees to obsessively hunt for the low-hanging fruit simply to justify their daily existence on the payroll.
Which raises a fundamental question about the efficacy of this entire theatrical production. Do these buzzwords actually fool the audience?
You mean leadership?
Yeah. When a mid-level manager sits in a quarterly review and says, "We are pivoting our strategy to aggressively harvest the low-hanging fruit in order to synergize our bandwidth and move the needle on client retention," does the vice president listening to that genuinely think, "My God, what a brilliant, unparalleled strategic mind"?
Probably not.
Or Is everyone in the room, from the intern to the CEO, simply in on the exact same collective, cynical linguistic joke, and we are all just dutifully reciting the script because the script is mandatory?
The sociological data heavily points toward the latter. It is a shared, almost ritualistic delusion. Anthropologists who embed within corporate structures frequently document that the vast majority of employees privately mock these phrases.
They roll their eyes in the break room.
Exactly. However, participating in this shared, mocked vocabulary is a critical signaling mechanism. It is a tribal shibboleth.
A shibboleth, you have to prove you belong.
Yes. By utilizing the jargon, even jargon you know is inherently ridiculous, you are transmitting a vital signal to leadership. You are proving that you belong to the tribe, that you have internalized the cultural norms, and that you understand the unspoken rules of the game.
Even if both you and the vice president know that synergize is a hollow construction, your willingness to say it with a straight face proves that you are a culture fit.
Conversely, a stubborn refusal to utilize the jargon and insistence on speaking in plain, blunt English can quietly mark you as an outsider. It signals a subtle rebellion, a lack of full commitment to the corporate identity, which can be deeply detrimental to your career trajectory.
So the true test of loyalty isn't how hard you work. It's your willingness to speak the nonsense fluently to prove you are fully assimilated into the collective.
That's one way to frame it, yes.
That is a deeply terrifying realization. But all of this posturing, the dodging in meetings, the theatrical inflation of your daily tasks, it's all just preamble. It all inevitably funnels toward one specific, highly structured event.
Judgment Day.
The annual or quarterly performance review. This is the crucible where corporate language ceases to be merely silly, status jockeying fluff and morphs into a heavy, rigid, legally mandated armor used to soften and deliver brutal truths.
The performance review is the arena where the inherent grinding contradictions of American workplace culture are forced to the surface.
Because you can't dodge anymore.
Right. To decode the language used in these closed-door sessions, we first have to understand the specific cultural and legal stage on which they are conducted. American workplace culture, driven by a complex mix of mid-century optimism and modern consumerism, values the outward projection of positivity to an absolute extreme.
It frequently borders on the absurd.
It does. Direct, unvarnished confrontation or blunt criticism is deeply uncomfortable for the American psyche. But beyond mere discomfort, bluntness is actively, aggressively discouraged by modern human resources departments.
Because of legal risks.
Yes, it's rooted in risk mitigation. Direct criticism, if poorly phrased, can trigger defensive emotional reactions, allegations of a hostile work environment, or, the ultimate corporate fear, wrongful termination lawsuits.
So the entire apparatus of communication is essentially held hostage by the fear of litigation or emotional outbursts. Everyone is just terrified of getting sued or having an employee cry in the office.
Precisely. The HR department's primary directive is the protection of the corporation as an entity. Therefore, managers are strictly trained and required to heavily encode their criticisms.
They are structurally forbidden from simply saying what they mean.
They must take the bitter pill of negative feedback and wrap it in thick, easily digestible layers of positive-sounding, forward-looking euphemisms.
Let's examine how this decoding works in practice, specifically when dealing with employee failure. The phrases highlighted in the source material for this are room for growth and manage expectations.
That's classics.
Imagine you are sitting in that uncomfortable chair in your boss's office, and they look at you and say, you know, your client presentations are incredibly strong, but looking at the metrics, there is definitely room for growth in your data analysis.
They're not complimenting your potential.
No, they are not saying you are a vibrant seedling stretching your leaves toward the sun. They are telling you, in legally sanitized code, that you are actively failing at data analysis and you are missing your deadlines.
Room for growth and its equally insidious cousin, opportunity for improvement, are the textbook examples of encoded criticism.
Opportunity for improvement. Wow.
The literal definitions of the words growth and opportunity suggest expansion, potential, and positive upward momentum. But the actual universally understood meaning within the context of the review is inadequacy, structural deficiency, and underperformance.
It requires an Olympic level of real-time mental gymnastics for an employee to sit in that chair, hear the word growth, hear the word opportunity, process the tone of the room, and realize in a fraction of a second that they are actually being told they are failing at their job.
It borders on psychological gaslighting, frankly.
It does. You are being handed a verbal bouquet of flowers and told it is a reprimand. And then we have manage expectations.
Yeah.
Our source material points out that this phrase translates to, we need to lower our standards because we completely failed to deliver what we explicitly promised.
For example, if a massive software launch is delayed by 6 months, the project manager will say, we need to get on a call and manage the client's expectations.
It is an astonishing rhetorical trick. It takes a massive internal failure, a blown deadline, a shattered budget, and aggressively frames it as if the client's internal psychological state was the actual problem all along.
Oh, our product isn't late. Your expectations are just a bit unmanaged. Let's just rein your imagination back in.
Exactly. It entirely shifts the burden of the failure. It removes the weight from the company's operational inability to deliver and places it squarely onto the recipient's emotional state. The failure is transmuted into a misunderstanding.
But as deceptive and frustrating as that particular euphemism is, it pales in comparison to the linguistic acrobatics the corporate entity performs when it comes to the ultimate separation.
You mean firing people, the termination of employment?
Yes. The language surrounding termination is the most heavily armored dialect in the entire corporate lexicon. Let us decode the two specific phrases highlighted in the material going in a different direction and right-sizing.
Okay, let's start with different direction.
When an individual employee is called into a room and told, we appreciate your contributions, but the company has decided to go in a different direction, it is the ultimate frictionless euphemism for being fired or having your specific role eliminated.
Thanks for all the late nights, but our compass is pointing away from you now.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the phrase different direction performs a very specific psychological operation. It entirely removes the concept of personal failure or interpersonal conflict from the narrative of the firing.
It makes it abstract.
It frames the termination as a simple, abstract matter of organizational geography or impersonal strategy. It communicates it is not that you are incompetent, and it's not that we dislike you. It is merely that the vast, unknowable corporate ship is altering its heading, and you simply do not fit on the new navigational chart.
It is a highly engineered way to strip a person of their livelihood while aggressively avoiding the messy, emotional fallout of looking them in the eye and saying, your labor is no longer valuable to us.
It denies the employee the closure of knowing why they were actually let go, substituting strategy for honesty. But the absolute zenith of this depersonalization is the word right-sizing.
Just hearing the word right-sizing creates a visceral reaction. It makes my skin crawl. It is the ultimate dystopian corporate code for mass layoffs.
It is the apex of the form. Consider the reality. An executive team mismanages a budget or fails to adapt to market conditions, and as a result, they must terminate the employment of 500 people to save the quarterly profit margin.
But they will never publicly say, we failed, so we are firing 500 human beings.
Never. Instead, they release a memo stating, we are right-sizing the organization to align with current market dynamics. By strategically utilizing the prefix right, they instantly, almost magically, reframe a mass human trauma into a moral and operational positive.
Because it implies they were wrong sized before.
Exactly. It implants the subconscious assumption that the company was previously wrong-sized, that it was bloated, sluggish, and inefficient. Therefore, severing the livelihoods of hundreds of families is merely a logical, mathematical correction necessary to achieve a state of organizational purity.
It deliberately, surgically removes all the humanity, all the devastation of lost health insurance and unpaid mortgages, and frames the event as a rational, strategic, and ultimately correct algebraic equation.
It's remarkably cold.
But I have to bring up a massive, glaring contradiction in that strategy. Doesn't calling a mass layoff or right-sizing actually breed exponentially more resentment among the surviving employees and the people fired than if the leadership just possessed the courage to be honest?
How do you mean?
Think about human nature. If you lose your job and the CEO stands up and says, I am deeply sorry, the market tanked, we made bad bets, we ran out of capital, and we have to lay you off, you will be devastated, you will be angry, but you might eventually respect the stark honesty of the admission.
That's true.
But if they look at you and say, we are right-sizing our human capital matrix, you are going to be absolutely furious. It is exactly like going to a doctor, and the doctor puts you on a brutal 800-calorie-a-day starvation diet, but they absolutely insist on looking you in the eye and calling it a gastric optimization program.
That's a brutal analogy.
You are still starving, your stomach is still empty, but now you also deeply resent the doctor because they think you were stupid enough to fall for the PR rebrand.
The gastric optimization analogy is brutally accurate, and it perfectly highlights the cognitive dissonance of the phrase. You are entirely correct about the resentment. This is a thoroughly documented phenomenon in organizational psychology and behavioral economics.
The employees are not fools.
They see straight through the linguistic sleight of hand, and it instantly incinerates any remaining trust in leadership. It breeds deep, lasting cynicism.
So the logical question is, if it destroys internal trust, why do corporations rigidly adhere to doing it?
The answer is that the word right-sizing is not, and never was, meant for the employees who are losing their jobs.
Wait, if it's not for the people being fired and it's not for the people staying, who is the audience for this performance?
The audience is external. The audience is the shareholders. The audience is the financial press, the institutional investors, and Wall Street analysts.
Well,
the language of right-sizing is a highly calibrated signal broadcast to the financial markets. It tells the market that the management team is not panicking, but is instead in total control, making proactive, clinical, and unsentimental decisions to protect profit margins and shareholder value.
in the calculus of modern corporate governance, the deep resentment of the fired employees is just collateral damage.
Entirely acceptable collateral costs in exchange for maintaining a narrative of ruthless strategic competence in the public markets. The stock price frequently goes up when a company announces a right sizing. The language is functioning exactly as intended.
That is deeply, profoundly cynical. It is the total financialization of human language. And that chilling realization leads us perfectly into the final, inescapable arena of our deep dive.
The inbox.
Yes, the inbox. Because when professionals aren't hiding behind verbal euphemisms face-to-face or in closed-door reviews, they are permanently documenting their interactions in text. We are moving from the ephemeral nature of verbal evasion to the unforgiving reality of digital permanence.
We are entering the realm of email etiquette and the passive-aggressive paper trail.
Email presents a uniquely fascinating sociolinguistic challenge, doesn't it?
It does. Because it is a purely text-based medium, it completely strips away all the nonverbal cues we rely on for accurate communication, kinesics or body language, vocalics or tone of voice, and microexpressions.
Without those cues, the potential for catastrophic misinterpretation is astronomically high.
A simple, neutral sentence can be read as a mortal insult, depending on the recipient's mood. Consequently, over the past 3 decades, corporate email culture has evolved a highly stylized, ultra-polite, heavily regimented format.
And this extreme politeness is frequently weaponized to mask deep, seething, unprofessional levels of irritation.
It's the ultimate passive-aggressive battleground.
You are fighting a war with pleasantries. And there is absolutely no greater, more devastating weapon on this digital battlefield than the phrase, "per my last email."
It is widely considered the ultimate expression of contained corporate rage.
It is absolutely lethal. When you open your inbox and read a sentence that starts with, "Per my last email, the client deliverables are due by Friday," you are not just reading a scheduling reminder.
Not at all.
What you are actually reading, the true subtext vibrating off the screen is, "I already explicitly told you this information, you absolute clown. I suggest you try actually utilizing your reading comprehension skills on the words I already took the time to type out for you."
It is dripping with unvarnished disdain, but it is wearing a tuxedo.
Dripping with disdain.
The mechanics of per my last email are genuinely fascinating from a linguistic standpoint. It utilizes the conventions of extreme, almost archaic formality to deliver a stinging rebuke.
The word per itself is a Latin preposition.
Right, sounds highly official, clinical, and almost legalistic. Because the rules of professional conduct strictly forbid the use of profanity, capitalization, or emotional outbursts in an email, the frustrated employee is forced to weaponize the very politeness that constrains them.
By explicitly pointing to the previous transmission, they are engaging in the digital equivalent of an irrefutable presentation of evidence.
The subtext is clear. I am not the operational bottleneck here. Your cognitive failure to read my previous instructions is the bottleneck, and I am establishing the time-stamped proof of my competence against your incompetence.
The timestamps are the truly deadly part. It is exactly like a prosecutor standing in front of a jury and pointing to Exhibit A. It leaves the recipient with absolutely no room to maneuver.
None.
And speaking of gathering evidence, we have to analyze the phrase, "just looping you in." On the surface, this sounds like the pinnacle of collaborative corporate teamwork. "Hey, Sarah, just looping you in on this email thread with the vendor."
It sounds like you are generously sharing the wealth of knowledge, ensuring everyone has visibility.
Right. It creates the illusion of transparency.
However, organizational behaviorists drawing on theories of defensive bureaucracy note that there is frequently a much darker, highly strategic hidden motive. While it can occasionally be a genuine, benign attempt to share information, the act of looping someone in, particularly when that someone is a manager or stakeholder, is very frequently an aggressive act of corporate self-defense.
You are gathering a witness to a crime.
Precisely. Consider the timeline of a failing project. When a timeline begins to slip, when a vendor begins to miss deliverables, or when a client becomes increasingly unreasonable, an experienced employee will intuitively sense the impending disaster.
At that exact moment, they reply to the thread and loop in their superior.
They are not explicitly asking the boss to intervene and solve the problem yet. What they are doing is establishing a real-time, time-stamped paper trail.
They are essentially saying, I want you, the person who evaluates my performance, to bear witness to this train wreck happening in real time.
I am putting this on your radar now, so that in 3 weeks, when the project completely derails and the executives demand to know who is at fault, you cannot feign ignorance and you cannot place the blame on me.
It is an act of preemptive damage control. It is documentary proof that you were communicating while the ship was sinking.
Exactly.
I am just casually adding you to the CC line purely so my hands are washed clean of this impending explosion. It is incredible to realize just how much institutional paranoia is baked right into the DNA of these seemingly helpful everyday phrases.
It's all defense.
But it's not all aggressive defense. A lot of email is just pure, unadulterated filler. And the undisputed king of the filler is, I hope this email finds you well. Our source material explicitly designates this as the most meaningless, hollow phrase in the entire American corporate ecosystem.
But it is hard to argue with that.
You are demanding a Q3 spreadsheet from someone you barely know, and you start with, Hi, Dave, I hope this email finds you well. It's absurd.
And finally, on the opposite end of the timeline, we have going forward. As in going forward, let's make sure we double-check the macro formulas before we present the deck.
Going forward is a masterpiece of conflict resolution through historical erasure.
Right. When a manager says going forward, they are technically acknowledging that a mistake occurred. We clearly messed up the formulas in the past. But the phrase acts as a strict verbal injunction against any emotional dwelling, any assigning of specific blame, or any litigating of the error.
It tells the employee, we are not going to waste our bandwidth arguing about whose fault this was. We are simply going to establish a new contractual reality where you agree to never ever make this specific mistake again.
It forces all organizational energy toward future compliance, completely bypassing the messy human friction of a genuine apology or a post-mortem argument.
So what does this all mean? When we step back and look at this entire digital tapestry, the weaponized politeness of per my last email, the paranoid paper trails of looping you in, the historical erasure of going forward, and the hollow pleasantry of, I hope this finds you well, what is the ultimate takeaway?
That's the real question.
Why do we fiercely cling to, I hope this finds you well? Is it genuinely meant to be passive-aggressive? Or is it merely the modern digital equivalent of writing Dear Sir or Madam at the top of parchment? Is it just a vestigial reflex that we can't evolve past?
This raises an important question about our relationship with digital communication. As we discussed earlier, email inherently strips away our humanity. It reduces flesh and blood individuals to sterile text on a glowing screen, delivering transactional demands to other glowing screens.
Yeah.
I theorize that we cling so desperately to phrases like, I hope this finds you well, because on a subconscious level, we are attempting to simulate warmth in a deeply cold medium.
We know it's a cold medium.
We inherently understand that the email format is frictionless and robotic. Therefore, we invent these standardized, highly predictable pleasantries to insert a tiny artificial buffer of human concern before we launch into our transactional demands for data, spreadsheets, and deliverables.
It is a reflex, absolutely, but it is a reflex born of a desperate psychological need to remind both the recipient and ourselves that there are actual human beings on both sides of the transaction.
Right.
Even if, in doing so, we sound exactly like poorly programmed robots trying to simulate what human empathy sounds like, it is like an alien wearing a poorly fitting human suit walking up to a desk and saying, I hope your biological functions are operating optimally on this rotation of the Earth. Please send the Q3 retention report.
That is a deeply accurate, if slightly surreal, visualization.
Yeah.
It is a necessary fiction. It is the social lubricant required to keep the massive grinding gears of global commerce turning without everyone feeling entirely irreparably alienated from one another by noon on a Tuesday.
Which brings us to the end of our journey through the sources today. We have covered an immense amount of linguistic and sociological ground. We have fundamentally established that American corporate jargon is not just a list of annoying, silly words.
It's really not.
It is a highly complex, carefully evolved, and deeply necessary ecosystem of survival. You have the dialect of deferral in the meeting rooms, utilizing the geometric impossibilities of circle backs and the artificial safety of pins to dodge accountability.
You have the theatrical, inflated buzzwords that create the mesmerizing illusion of productivity, synergizing your bandwidth to leverage the low-hanging fruit.
You have the absurdly positive euphemisms acting as heavy legal armor to mask failure and sanitize the brutality of mass layoffs. And finally, you have the passive-aggressive, highly paranoid digital paper trails permanently etched into your inbox.
And the most vital, actionable takeaway from all of this analysis for you, the listener, is this. While you might find these phrases logically meaningless, deeply frustrating, or completely eye-roll-inducing, you cannot afford to ignore them.
You really can't.
Fluently understanding and decoding this language is the master key to thriving, or at the very least surviving with your sanity intact in the U.S. workplace. When you truly understand the structural subtext, when you realize that the language is designed to protect the system, not to insult you, you stop taking the coded criticisms personally.
That's the key right there.
You realize that being told you have room for growth is not an attack on your fundamental character. It is simply the required, legally sanitized linguistic dance of the modern American office. You learn the rules of the game so the game doesn't break you.
You learn to navigate that map even when the compass is spinning and the ink is constantly disappearing. But I want to leave you with one final, deeply provocative thought to mull over as you go back to your day.
Don't worry.
We have spent this entire deep dive dissecting how human beings use this specific jargon to protect themselves, simulate empathy, and sound productive. But right now, the architecture of the workplace is shifting faster than at any point since the Industrial Revolution.
Oh, absolutely.
Remote work is isolating us further behind screens, turning more and more of our interactions into pure text. And far more importantly, artificial intelligence is increasingly literally writing our emails for us. You hit a single button, and the AI algorithm automatically suggests, I hope this finds you well. Per my last email, let's circle back on this next week.
It writes the jargon for us.
Right. So the question you have to ask yourself is this. As AI takes over the mechanical burden of our communication, will this entire ecosystem of corporate jargon eventually die out because we no longer need to manually construct these buffers to protect our own human fragility?
Why?
Or, and this is the truly wild possibility, will the AI learn from decades of our paranoid, passive-aggressive emails and invent an entirely new, exponentially more complex, even more robotic layer of polite corporate euphemisms?
It's a scary thought.
Will the machines invent a new dialect of productivity theater that we, the humans, will then have to frantically try and decode just to understand what our own computers are saying to each other?
A truly fascinating and slightly terrifying sociological prospect. We may just have to put a pin in that exact question for a future discussion.
We will definitely circle back to it. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into the source material. We'll catch you next time.